Good morning, everyone. This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University. Thanks for joining us for another installment of our series, Understanding Our New World. And today I'm really delighted that we're joined by Bill Hoagland, who is one of the leading budget experts in the United States. Let me tell you a little bit about Bill. Bill, by the way, is a senior vice president at the Bipartisan Policy Center. He's going to be joining us from Washington. But let me tell you a little bit about Bill. He's a native of Indiana, grew up there, attended the U.S. Merchant Marine, and holds degrees from Purdue and Penn State. He worked for the federal government for about 30 years in both the Department of Agriculture, the Congressional Budget Office, and about 25 years as a senior Senate staffer, many of these years as a senior Republican staffer on the Senate Budget Committee. And Bill was one of these people who was one of the real experts in budget policy. Senators respected him, reporters respected him, staff respected him. Bill worked really hard. He was incredibly well informed, incredibly generous with reporters. As a budget reporter, I tagged around and talked to him quite a bit. And Bill was just this real fountain of information and perspective. So we're looking forward to a really wide-ranging talk with Bill about fiscal policy in particular, because that's one issue that in our presidential campaign, maybe one of several, that really hasn't gotten the focus that it should. So we're delighted to be joined with Bill. So Bill, thank you so much for taking some time.
Well, thank you, John, and you're very generous with your comments. I appreciate it very much. It's good to see you again. It's been a while.
Good, thank you. Well, Bill, let's talk just for a second about growing up in the Midwest. You are from a town called Covington, Indiana, not too far from Danville, across the river. Tell us a little bit. I know you are part of a farming family. Tell us a little bit about growing up in Covington.
Well, yes, thank you, John. Yes, the farm is just outside of this little town of Covington, Indiana, right across the Wabash River. Uh, and a family of a farm family. And by the way, the farm is still in the family today. It's been there it's called a Hoosier homestead because we've had the farm for over 100 years in our family's history. I had five brothers, or there's five of us, a basketball team, if you like, and we all at that time when we were growing up on the farm, it was a mixed farm, everything under the sun, poultry, swine, dairy, and mainly the main crops of course, corn and soybean for the Midwest. So very similar to the kinds of farms that they have right there. You have right there around SIU. It today is strictly corn and soybeans. And growing up in a small town, it was basic. Some of the basic principles and thoughts I have. As I mentioned to you in an earlier conversation, my father was a diehard Republican. My mother was a diehard Democrat. I'm not quite sure what I was, but that's kind of shaped my thinking going forward. I wanted to go to. It was a time of Sputnik, and I wanted to go and be an aeronautical engineer. And so I applied particularly to the Air Force Academy, but my appointment was at the United States Merchant Marine Academy that you mentioned, which was an engineering degree. But I quickly found out that I was not going to make a good sailor. And so after a second year at sea, when I couldn't even get beyond this Verrazanos Bridge in New York without getting seasick, I decided to go back to a landlocked university, and that was Purdue. And so that's where I went back and specialized, particularly in the areas of not in agriculture economics, but it was primarily focused not on the hogs, corn, cattle, hay side, but on the food consumption side, which led me to a major focus on food nutrition programs, and led later in my career to me being the administrator of the Federal Food Nutrition Service at Department of Agriculture.
Well, Bill, one of your first jobs, or an early job in Washington, was with the Congressional Budget Office in 1975. Alice Rivlin, kind of a legendary figure in Washington circles, was the first director of the CBO, and she brought you in 1975. I guess Congress was working on a farm bill, and CBO needed to figure out how to score various provisions of it. Talk about entering the CBO in those early years, because it really has become an important Washington institution.
It's a critical institution. Yes, the Congressional Budget Impoundment Control Act was enacted literally 50 years ago this last July. I also like to point out that I'm a little embellishing it just a little bit, but it was probably the last piece of legislation that President Nixon signed before he resigned in his position and flew back to California. And I've often wondered whether he would have signed that act, which created the CBO and the Senate Budget Committee and the House Budget Committee and a whole new process for the federal government putting together budgets. I often wonder, would he have signed that legislation had he not been under the situation? He knew he was going to be impeached a couple of weeks after he signed that legislation. But anyway, at CBO, when I finished my graduate work at Penn State, again, I was specializing in a particular program at that time called the Food Stamp Program. Now they call it the SNAP program. And my first job was at the Department of Agriculture in the agency that did that as an economist. And I hadn't been there longer than about 3 or 4 months when the phone call came from Alice Rivlin, and she said that we're going to have this major piece of legislation, that we've created this new organization. And the first piece of legislation that we're going to have to look at is a farm bill. At the end of every farm bill, and including the one that's now under debate right now in Congress, is what they call the nutrition title. And that's where she said, I need somebody to come and help me make estimates of that particular program, which was at that time still called the food stamp program. So I took a risk. I didn't know. I was new, I was young, green behind the ears, a brand new agency. It just getting started. I was one of the first or second, third, fourth employees behind Bob Reichar, who was the deputy at that time. And that's how I went to CBO, and where I spent, I think, the next 5 years before going back to that agency that I had been just a junior economist at. And we don't need to go there too far, but got into a little bit of a tuffle over an issue called called ketchup as a vegetable, and went back to the Hill to work in the Senate Budget Committee. During my time at CBO, I worked with Senator Dole, Senator George McGovern, and they were both on the Agriculture Committee, and they asked me to come back and work for the Budget Committee, which was at that time being chaired by Senator Pete Domenici of New Mexico. And that's where I spent the rest of my career, Paul, except for the last 4 or 5 years where I was in the Senate Majority Leader's office, Senator Bill Frist, and they're doing a budget and appropriations also.
Well, let's talk for a second, Bill, about Pete Domenici. He's one of these senators who is really important and consequential. Unfortunately, has faded a little bit from the history books. But Senator Domenici was one of the really critical figures, along with Senator Dole, I think, in the 80s, in the Republican side of the ledger, to really push hard on fiscal discipline and to bring the budget into balance. Reagan had passed some big tax cuts. There was a budget hole that needed to be filled. So let's talk for a second, if you would, on Senator Domenici and what his importance is in American budget history.
Well, Senator Domenici, and who passed away a couple of years ago, was from New Mexico, basically a Democratic state. Here's a Republican. And he was the longest serving Republican from the state of New Mexico, largely because not only was he interested in fiscal sustainability, he also, quite frankly, was interested in taking care of his state, as every senator does. So he had this kind of some people would say it was hypocritical. It wasn't hypocritical. He'd say, I'll produce a budget, and that budget will be sustainable, and we should pay for our whatever resources we have. We should pay for it. If we don't have the resources, we shouldn't be spending our money. We should try to balance our federal budget, or at least restrain the growth in the budget, the debt of this country. Once that budget was set, he was going to work very hard for his state of New Mexico for whatever piece he could get out. As you will remember, John, and he was also on the Appropriation Committee. So once the budget was set, he would work with it. Very very attuned to the state, but also very attuned nationally. He worked very closely with, when he was chair, the first majority leader right after Reagan was elected was Howard Baker from New Mexico, great, from Tennessee, great senator. Missed him. And then, of course, later Senator Dole. During the 1990s, and I think you were covering this in your work on the Hill, there was a movement, particularly as it relates to the House of Representatives under Newt Gingrich, to have try to reach a balanced budget. And so there was a lot of pressure coming from the House of Representatives and Newt Gingrich work. Senator Domenici, Senator Dole worked with the House as much as they could, but at the end of the day, they ended up working particularly with the president, President Clinton, who had a focus himself on a sustainable fiscal future. And so we had a lot, as you'll recall, we had a lot of knockdown, drag-out fights. We had a number of government first until recently. The longest government shutdowns we had were over the budget, but we were able to come together 1997, 1998, and in a bipartisan way put together a federal budget that quite frankly led to surpluses in 1999, 2000, 2001. And in fact, the story I always want to tell is that we were having an election, of course, a presidential election with President Clinton was finished, his term was finished. Al Gore was running for president. George W. Bush was running for president in the fall of 2000. CBO and where I'd been and worked and Alan Greenspan's Federal Reserve were all projecting in 2000 and in fact, in January of 2001, a surplus as far as the eyes could see. And so Mr. Bush wins the office, George W. Bush wins the office, comes into office, and in that office, he says one thing: we've got the surplus that's being projected. Everybody's projecting this big surplus. And as hard as it is to believe this day and age that big surpluses can be as damaging as big deficits. And so what you want to do is you want to equalize as much as our revenues with our expenditures. And so what was proposed was to return some of that surplus to the American public in a tax cut. And in a bipartisan Senate, which was 50-50 at that time, we did enact in the spring of 2001 a 10-year tax cut, along with other changes that was to bring some of that surplus back down because we had been so successful in, quite frankly, achieving a balanced budget. And the story I tell is that it was the morning of that legislation that had the 10-year tax cut was enacted in I think June, July of 2001. It's the morning of September 11th, 2001, and I'm in my office cubicle there. I think I was working in the Capitol that morning, preparing a speech for a senator. I think it was Senator Domenici's speech to give that afternoon about what we called at that time was a Saturday Night Live skit, Lockbox. We're going to lockbox away this surplus. And I had two little TVs. It's early in the morning, one in the Senate, one in the House. And they were not in session, so they were on network channels. And looked up, saw the first plane, said, "Well, that's an accident. I'll keep working on it." And then the second plane, I thought, well, it's not quite right. And literally, before I could put my pencil down, I was told to vacate the premises because a third plane was headed toward the Capitol. I put that speech away. It never came out again. And almost overnight, we went from surpluses to deficits. And if one were to draw a chart, which I have, you will see that we go from surpluses to deficit almost immediately. Well,
Bill,
to do that, but there it is. We were at surpluses, and then bam, we went to deficits. Anyway, that was, and we've been on that path since.
Bill, I want to pick up on that because I remember also I was a reporter back then, and this was, I think, in January of 2001. And Alan Greenspan was testifying. I thought it was before the Senate Budget Committee. It could have been
He
banking
was,
with
he
budget.
was, he
It was
was.
budget. And Greenspan was actually talking at some length and under some fairly significant questioning about the complications of paying off the national debt and how that might disrupt global financial markets. And so he was literally talking about the dangers of paying off the national debt. And and then, fast forward, and I want to kind of talk about our fiscal predicament. And as you say, I mean, we went from surplus as far as the eye can see to this staggering $35 trillion debt we have now. And it seems to me that sort of two broad categories. I mean, first of all, Congress has been reacting to events, whether it was 9/11, 2008 financial crisis, COVID. So it's done some major policy responses to crises, but it's also done the things that Congress does, passes new spending programs, passes tax cuts, and the cumulative effect has been just an astonishing turnaround in the country's fiscal fortune. So see if you can kind of break down those two categories of sort of responses to clear crises versus just the kind of tax cuts that everyone wants and the spending increases and enhancement of programs that are so popular.
Well, John, it's a good question, and it's a question that we wrestle with, and I've been pushing this rock up the hill a number of times. It's rolled back down over me, and I will say that let's start from the beginning here, and that is that growing up there in the Midwest, I had this built into me that one should try to balance their expenditures with their revenues, whether you're running a university or an institute, or whether you're a business, or whether you're a farm or wherever, you want to families. You want to try to make sure that your revenues and your expenditures, because you don't want to accumulate that debt. And so, yes, I'm of that mindset that deficits do matter and debt does matter. I'm not so naive, though, to say that there aren't times when your federal government shouldn't intervene when there are particular issues that are critical to the country's fiscal to the country's situation. Let's take an example right now today as it relates to the hurricanes that we're going through. Those are major disasters that we have to help out. That's our responsibility in times of such as the pandemic. Those we had to react. So there are times when your federal government does need to run a deficit. But when, like what we like to say, when the sun's shine, you make hay. When things are good, you try to balance, you try to use that time of goodness to bring down that deficit. By the way, I remember distinctly the morning that Alan Greenspan came before the Budget Committee. It was a snowy morning. We weren't sure we were going to be able to pull it off because it was snowing here in DC. It's early January when we have those kinds of hearings. And his concern was, particularly as it relates to monetary policy, managing debt and deficits required selling treasury bills and things of that nature. And what would he do if there weren't any treasury bills? So that was his concern. Of course, he didn't have to worry, as I say, it didn't take too long before we're back into a situation. But I'm going to go to my maker, and we're not going to see a balanced budget again in history. What we're trying to do now, though, seems to me, is to try to find a way to stabilize what's been growing. And to stabilize today our debt that you mentioned in terms of $35 trillion is growing. And by the way, it will continue to grow under just current policy. Just put this big bird on automatic pilot, don't change anything. It's still going to grow because of the programs that have been put in place that will continue. My generation, admittedly, I don't know, we had a great generation. I don't know if we're the bad generation or not, is basically taking on those particular programs, whether it's Medicare or Social Security, those major what we call entitlement programs that are major drawers. if you were to put the whole federal budget on one hand, there are thousands of accounts, as you know, John, in the federal budget. But if you were to put it on one hand, you can boil it down very simply. It's Social Security, it's Medicare, it's Medicaid, it's our national security, just paying our national security, and then paying the interest on the public debt. Think about that. All those other programs, farm programs, child nutrition programs, TSA, SBA, Border Patrol, all environmental programs, Department of Commerce, Department of Transportation, those all make up less than 15% of federal spending. The issue here of how do you control that going forward, and I'm not trying to filibuster you here, John, but the issue of going forward is you cannot, if it's spending you're worried about, you can't do this by simply going to that 15% of the federal budget. You've got to look at the total budget, and that includes, admittedly, the most difficult politically for individuals, members of Congress or senators or people running for office, and that's to talk about those entitlement programs. And that's difficult. I think there's the academics will refer to it as what the prisoner syndrome. It's difficult for them to do that thing that would benefit them the most is not to touch Social Security and Medicare, which I understand politically, but then that is the worst thing that can be done as it relates to our fiscal situation going forward long term. Now, the alternative, not pleasant either, is, well, then raise taxes, raise revenue. If you're going to have these expenditures, they're on the books, you're going to pay for them, and pay for them with increasing taxes. That's not popular either, of course. And so we have the situation literally right now where we have two presidential candidates, and I don't want to get into the politics here too far, but we have two presidential candidates that are not truly addressing the long-term fiscal situation the country faces. Extension of expiring tax provisions coming up next year is nearly a $5 trillion, if you spend them for another 10 years, is it $5 trillion? How are you going to pay for that, cutting taxes? Some of the proposals that the vice president has put forth also increase the deficit and debt over the next 10 years by $2 to $3 trillion. Neither one of them are salient in my point as one who believes that debt and deficits matter, are addressing the real issue here, which is we have to have trade-offs, we have to make compromise, and that gets us back to being bipartisan like we were during the Clinton and Dole and Domenici years, where they didn't like doing what they had to do personally with some of the policies, but the trade-off was worse, and so they ended up working together across the aisle to address these issues. So I'll stop there.
Well, Bill, just one thing that's striking to me is the Congressional Budget Office, your former agency, just recently reported that in fiscal year 2024, the U.S. will have, I think, a $1.8 trillion deficit. And I mean, when you pull back and say, we're not in the midst of a recession or a major land war or anything, it's like we're close to, this was during close to a full employment economy, and we still run budget deficits of nearly $2 trillion. And I remember the first budget I covered in 1991, the entire federal budget was 1.3 trillion. So, I mean, but to kind of play off your point, I mean, we can get kind of freaked out by this 35 trillion. There's no way we're going to pay that all off. But what are the steps forward? I mean, how do the focus, I think, as you've been saying earlier, is that we need to start bringing that 1.8 trillion down very substantially, and some sort of bipartisan package that combines changes in popular programs with revenue increases, and it probably can't all be done by taxing rich people and corporations. I mean, what are the parameters of an agreement that will serve the interests of the United States long term?
Well, two things. Number one, what I have for years have wanted to see a more balanced budget. I've given up. I don't think I'll ever see a balanced budget ever again. In other words, that we have a zero deficit. But what we do, and what the economist and any economists there at SIU and others will probably say, what your real goal is to stabilize the level of debt that we have accumulated in our economy. And when you and I started our career, when I started my career on CBO, the level of total debt to the size of the economy was something about 28% of the GDP. Today, it's 100% and on a path to continue to grow. There were times along the way where I say, well, let's stabilize it at 50% of GDP, or let's stabilize it at 60%. And now, quite frankly, I'd just be happy if we could stabilize it at 100%, which still would require significant changes in policy over the next 10 years. I think the estimates are as much as $7 trillion in either tax increases or spending reductions, or a combination of the two. But what is really of concern to me is what I mentioned as one of those elements that is driving spending, is just paying the interest on that accumulated debt. The CBO number you mentioned, $1.8 trillion, quite frankly, that's an estimate. We will know at the end of the month when the Treasury closes out its books. I have thought it's going to be closer to $2 trillion, but let's just assume that. You should know, and your listeners should know, that we are, of that 1.8 trillion that is estimated today, 900 billion is just being paid to the bondholders that have lent us the money to be able to carry forth on all these other programs. That is in excess of what we are spending on national security. And I'm struck by my light just went out here. I don't know what that. I'm struck by a comment that many of your academics will know there as economists and historians, Niall Ferguson out at Stanford University. And he had a comment recently which really disturbed me. He said that any great power that spends more on debt service than on defense will not stay a great power very long. And that's been true of the Habsburg Spain. That's true of France and the Ottoman Empire. That's true of the British Empire. It's something that we have to be concerned about, that we are that interest payment. That's what I'm focused on. How do we lower that level of interest payment? And the way to do that is only to reduce the level of debt and deficits over a period, or at least slow the rate of growth going forward.
Bill, I mean, as you had mentioned during the presidential campaign, neither candidate has really kind of laid out a comprehensive budget, but I know budget experts have kind of calculated their various campaign promises. And there's a group I know you're very familiar with, the Committee on a Responsible Federal Budget, which looked at Vice President Harris's various initiatives. And they said the costs over 10 years would range, the high estimate would be 8 trillion. The more modest and compromise estimate would be 3.5 trillion. And for Donald Trump, the high end of his costs would be $15 trillion, the low end, 7.5 trillion. And I want to kind of frame this in just what has happened to our politics, because back in the day in the 1990s, when you were a staffer and I was a reporter, it seemed like every day there was a new press conference about laying out a budget plan to bring the budget into balance. And a lot of the plans were not overly solid, but some of them were, and some of them were creative. But I want you to reflect on this, Bill, in terms of the politics of the budget. It seems like we have almost this impossible problem where we have a complicated problem, and there are no political penalties for avoiding it, and there are no particular political benefits for confronting it. So candidates can continue to they'll say, against wasteful Washington spending, but they don't really offer much in the way of plans. They're not really being punished by voters. So, I mean, how do we get to a point where that we have an incentive structure that this problem is confronted?
Well, I wish I knew the answer to this question, because it's been the one that's daunting for me a awful long time. And I don't want to be a total gloom and doomer here. I realize this is a tough subject to talk about without getting somewhat very black, I guess, is the way to think about it in terms of downward. I recall, and you will remember him quite well, as the chairman of the House Budget Committee on the Democratic side, Leon Panetta. And then he later became OMB director. He was White House chief of staff for Clinton, CIA director, Department of Defense. Really a real good public servant. And in fact, I talked to him a couple of months ago about some issues. And he, in leaving town here, one of your fellow reporters interviewed him, John, about, as he was departing to go back to California to the Panetta Institute, where he was asked about this very issue you just raised. And he said there are two ways things get done in Washington, D.C. One is by crisis, and one is by leadership. And I hope that we don't have to go to the crisis stage, but that is what usually focuses the attention. And what is that crisis? That crisis is when people say, wait a minute, remember that about 30% of our debt is not owned by you and me and Americans, it's owned by foreign investors. And there comes it, as our old friend Rudy Pinner likes to say, we're the best looking horse in the glue factory. And there may come a time when they say, wait a minute, I'm not sure about them paying back what I've lent to them, and I'm going other places. But when that happens, just simple economics, we still have the debt. How do you fund it? You have to raise interest rate. You have to pay more to pay more to the people who are lending us the money. And that drives up interest rates. Driving up interest rates, that's the crisis that really it turns us into a situation that is unbearable, and then we have to act in some way. I'm always there's that old Hemingway "Sun Also Rises," where Bill asked Mike, "How did you go bankrupt?" And Mike's response was two ways: gradually and then suddenly. That's what we have to be careful about. And but back to your general question, I'm Midwestern optimist leadership. Maybe it doesn't appear that way right now, today, in the current presidential campaign, but I am convinced there are those both in Congress and hopefully in whatever administration that comes, that understands that you have to take leadership, you have to compromise. Pretty tough these days, as polarized as the country is, but the alternative is much worse. And that's why I think why I'm still at this is because I still think that we can find solutions to this and not get to the crisis stage that could be very, very significant for the country's future.
Bill, just a follow up with Panetta. I, had covered him as a budget reporter, and grew to really know him and like him a bit. He was such a tremendously smart and capable person. And some years later, he was director of CIA, and I was bumped into him in the Capitol, and they said, Mr. Director, we really miss you on the budget front. And he says, killing Al Qaeda is easier.
Oh no. Oh no.
And then we joked a little bit, and he was just, and so forth. But I mean, obviously a little bit of embellishment there. But it just talks about just the difficulty.
You should point out that you mentioned it earlier, the estimates from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget that I'm a board member of, Maya McGinnis's operation, is Leon Panetta and and Mitch Daniels, a Republican, are the chairs of that Committee for Responsible Federal. So they're still at it too, and they're still pushing that rock.
Well, Bill, tell us a little bit about the Bipartisan Policy Center. I know, I mean, by its essence, it's focused on finding bipartisan solution to problems. Tell us a little bit about its history, its work, and what I know you're also very interested in healthcare issues. So, some of the
Now,
projects you're working on.
it's a relatively new organization. It was established, it founded here by some of the great people that I had worked with over the years. It was founded by Senator Dole and Senator Howard Baker on the Republican side, Senator Tom Daschle, and Senator George Mitchell on the Democratic side. And by the way, I had a conversation with Senator Mitchell a couple of days ago. He's 91 years old, and I was he was another one of those great leaders who was willing to work together across the aisle, very partisan, but willing to work together. Anyway, the four founded this organization about 12 years ago. Some of my former bosses were here, Alice Rivlin and Senator Domenici, and they asked me to come over here. But yes, hard as it is to believe, in this town, there is an organization that tries to find common ground on some of these very difficult issues and fiscal policy. We have right now a major effort underway on a fiscal next year. As an example, next year, your listeners should know, is going to be regardless of who wins the election. Next year, that debt limit you were talking about, we're going to reach that statutory debt limit sometime in the spring, maybe early summer. That's the legislation that we have to pass legislation to increase our borrowing authority. We're going to hit that, and we're going to have to increase that $35 trillion figure sometime. That will require that will require bipartisan support in the end of the day, because, as you know, there will be 60 votes in the Senate, regardless of who wins the Senate. It's still going to be a very narrow margin. We also have coming up a major, which is one of the issues that former President Trump is focused on. That's the tax bill expires next year. When we passed that back in 2017, 10 years, it's up. We're coming up to that cliff when taxes will automatically go up significantly if we don't figure out a way to how we're going to extend that. And by the way, these deficit estimates out in the future assume that those tax cuts expire and revenues come in, but that's going to be very difficult, both for Republican. In fact, Vice President Harris has indicated that nobody with incomes under 400,000 would be impacted. I'm going to get myself in real trouble by saying this. I think that's an unfortunate statement. I don't think we can really. There isn't that much to tax above 400,000, even though, yes, I'm sure there needs to do something there. And then finally, right now, we are in a situation where we don't even have an appropriation and a budget for the fiscal year that's already begun here on the 1st of October, as you know. And so we're operating under what we call a continuing resolution. When they come back after the election in November the 12th or 13th, when they come back, they'll only have about 10, 15 days to finalize, if they're going to, the funding for the current fiscal year that began. I'm going to make a prediction. They're not going to be able to do that. We're going to have another continuing resolution. So we're going to have a confluence of lots of things happening early next spring: tax cuts, debt limit, and now the government shut down simply because we haven't funded government. This is going to be a really challenging year. I'll be straight with you and your listeners, and again, I probably shouldn't say all this, but I thought I've had it, and I admit that I'm tired of these fights. I've tried everything. I'm at that age where I need to spend more time with my grandchildren, as an example. But our new president here, former Secretary of Education, Margaret Spellings, has asked that I stay here so I don't miss out on the excitement of next year. So maybe I'll hang around a little longer, but it's get to the point where some of us are so frustrated with the politics of this town and the issues that we've just raised that it's time for somebody else to take over. Well, anyway, I'll stop there. That's it.
Well, Bill, I know you're going to have to scoot to a meeting in a second, but we've gotten to several questions that have been emailed, and one of them, one that's been emailed in, refers to your background and asks what mentors you've had. I know you worked for a very interesting gentleman by the name of Stephen Bell for some time, but how would you answer that more broadly, the mentors that have shaped your life and your career?
Well, that's a very, very good question. Of course, we'll begin with some family mentors, and I'll set those aside. But I had mentioned them all, a lot of them. Alice Rivlin was a huge mentor. Bob Reichar was another, and still to this day, a close friend. Obviously, Senator Domenici was a real leader. Bill Frist, Senator Frist, was another mentor of mine. I'm sure I'm leaving out others, but along the way here. Howard Baker was one of my favorites, and I'll never forget. I went and gave him a presentation one time. Senator Domenici said, "Go over and tell the senator, tell the leader. He was leader. Tell him about the path that we were on in terms of the budget." And I have those were the days of the whiteboards, and I went over to the whiteboards, and I'm sitting in front of just me and the senator and the leader, and I pull out my whiteboard, and I'm going through the whiteboard, and the leader, Senator Baker, says, "Bill, put that away. I'm a lawyer. If you can't explain it to me in English, you can't explain it." That was a lesson I learned early on, that with lots of numbers in my head, but if you can't explain it in English, it's kind of difficult with all the charts and figures that I still carry around in my mind. But anyway, Baker, Domenici, Alice Rivlin, clearly, Bill Armstrong along the way, Bill Frist, they were all just great. And like I say, Bob Reichar, I can't say enough for Bob as one of those people who really helped guide me in my early career.
Bill, final question: how do you relax? I know you've been working so hard on these big issues. I know your wife, as I understand it, is an art historian. Do you guys slip off to the DC museums and take in some art, or you mentioned grandchildren? How do you unwind from the budget battles?
Well, my wife would say I don't, but you're right. She's an art historian, and she takes groups to Europe. In fact, she'd love any of your listeners to take them to Europe on small art trips and things of that nature. I have gone on a couple with her, but basically, yes, we spend a little bit of time in art museums, and particularly here in Washington, of course, which are free. You don't have to pay to get into them. But I am still of that Midwestern ilk that I like to get my hands in the soil. So I try to garden. It's kind of hard here in Northern Virginia. The red clay of Northern Virginia is not the same as the Indiana black loam that I'm familiar with. But gardening and working in keeping my hands there, and then to the extent, in fact, I can't. Our grandchildren some of them are in Boston, and some of them are not too far away up in the middle of Pennsylvania, so spend a little time with them.
Great. Well, Bill, thank you for such a terrific conversation. I know, as I said, you're off to a meeting, and first of all, just congratulations and thank you for your public service. I mean, you've been, one of those people in the vineyards for 3 or 4 decades, just working on hard issues, and have done it with great integrity and great decency and great commitment. And I think Americans who see the Bill Hoaglands working in the vineyards would feel an awful lot better about our federal government and come to appreciate it more than it often is appreciated. So again, thank you for your service. And Continued work. I have a feeling that Bill Hoagland is going to come up with some more budget ideas before too much longer to help us get back on a stronger path.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you for all the work you do there at SIU and your institute. So thank you for the work you do and spreading the word, good word. I know you've had some great people on your show, and I think I'm glad that you keep that message going out there. So, and it's been good to see you again, John. So, been a long time. Take care.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you so much.
Thank
And
you.
thanks
Bye.
to all of you for watching another edition of our series, Understanding Our New World. We will have a video of this conversation on our website in the coming days. Please look at it, show it to family and friends, and thank you for helping support the Institute and keeping the memory of Paul Simon alive and well. Thank you so much.